Testing. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out tonight. It's great to see a full house. I'm Bernie Baker, a member of the Belfast Climate, Energy, and Utilities Committee, or the CEUC. The CEUC is a policy committee reporting to the Belfast City Council. There's some other members of the CEUC here tonight that I'd like to introduce to you. Tonight we have Patrick Walsh. There he is. Patrick is here. Sean Rummery, Jerry Brand, and Holly Wise. Other members of the committee are Dan Cowan, Skip Lucan, Judson Thomas, and Dave Summers. By the way, the CEUC holds meetings the first Thursday of every month in City Hall in Conference Room A at 4 o'clock. And we encourage and welcome your participation at those meetings. In the fall of 2023, the City Council adopted the Climate Action Plan written and submitted by the CEUC and some past members, John Beal, Fred Bowers, and Barbara Bell. The plan is devised to guide Belfast in becoming a more resilient and sustainable city by facing the threats posed by climate change. It's a forward-looking document that calls for action by the city's departments and administration, its committees, and all of us as individual citizens. On the back table, you'll find a piece of paper that gives you clear step-by-step instructions for accessing the Climate Action Plan on either the city's website or the library's website. So please do take a look at it, read it carefully. Don't wait for the Netflix version to come out, but start reading it and think about ways in which you can roll up your sleeves and get involved. The more hands, heads, and hearts we have working towards making Belfast more resilient, the further we will get. The Climate Action Plan's first policy recommendation reads, and I quote, "Assess vulnerabilities throughout Belfast's existing critical infrastructure systems and plan to upgrade, protect, or otherwise manage them for greater resilience." High on that list, as brought into sharp focus by last winter's devastating storms, is, quoting the Climate Action Plan again, "to develop a comprehensive plan to protect all of Belfast Harbor from sea level rise, storm-driven waves, and surge." Tonight's gathering is a crucial step in the lengthy, complicated, and quite frankly, expensive process of securing the west side of the harbor from the boathouse to the pedestrian bridge. In the months ahead, you will hear, and I hope participate, in creating a plan for mitigating climate-driven hazards throughout the whole city. But tonight we begin with a focus on a major heartbeat of the city, the harbor. To that end, I will hand the mic over to Belfast's Deputy Economic Director, Joellen Warren, who will introduce our presenters.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to see a packed house as we start this endeavor through the vulnerability assessment. The city did receive a grant of $50,000 last year through the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation and the Future for community resilience planning. And that's enabled the city to put out an RFP and hire an engineering firm to do just that, specific to the public facilities at the city harbor on the west side. This is not to say that this is the only action the city is taking. This is the first step of planning around vulnerabilities. And we have other applications in currently for additional funding for a hazard mitigation plan, which would be a citywide vulnerability assessment related to all types of vulnerabilities. We know the water is coming. That's a #1 vulnerability. But we also know that heat crisis, cold elements, storms, like tornadoes, hurricanes, wildfires. We're all susceptible to those types of vulnerabilities. And so this is just a jumping off point for the city. And certainly the storms brought it into focus that we needed to move quickly. So this is a fast moving project with GEI Consultants so that we can turn this information into the hazard mitigation plan, which is going to hopefully start this fall. So we are dedicated to this crisis and hoping to find answers with all of your support. So with that, I will introduce our consultants from GEI. They are from Portland, and we went through a competitive bid, and they were exceptional and bring a lot to the table. And using the information that a lot of the city partners have already developed, which is really important because this is not just a new thing. This is something that's been worked on for several years, and I want to thank a lot of you in the room for that. So Lisa Vickers and Elon Gasco came up from far away and a couple times now and have walked the harbor with us with the full committee. And so you'll hear from them as to some of their assessment and some adaptation measures. And we will welcome some Q&A at the end. So, hold your questions. Hopefully they can get through it and they can answer some of your initial questions. And then we'll start talking about the adaptation measures. Where do we go from here? What are the next steps? We'll be willing to stick around after the meeting for a short bit. And if people want to look at the maps and provide any additional statements, we can put them on the boards or there's sticky notes, so you can leave them with us. I also do want to mention that this is being recorded, so it'll be posted on the library and the city's website. So anybody who's not able to be here tonight can watch it, and they can get in touch with the city, either the city manager's office or the community development office and economic development office if they have additional questions. So with that, I will turn it off to Lisa. Thank you so much. Here. Oh, it's still.
All right. Well, thank you guys. This is an incredible turnout and just really shows how much, this is an important issue for the community. And so really happy to be here and see everyone. And I want to thank you all for hosting and helping to organize and advertising the meeting. So yeah, my name's Lisa Vickers. I am a senior coastal professional at GEI. I've been working in coastal projects in a range of residential, municipality, commercial development. We look at a range of issues dealing with waterfront structures that needs repair, or you want to address flooding, you elevate the structure. And I have Elon Gasco as well, and he's working a lot, and he'll talk a little bit in the presentation about the flood models and how we came up with different scenarios and the maps. So we have a great team at GEI. These are two of the project team members, but some of the others. Oh. Like lift it up too. I don't want to get too close because I don't want to shout, but no, for sure. My hair is not helping either. How is that? Does it feel like it's picking it up? Is that better? Is that okay? Great. Okay. So this is two members of our project team at GEI. We have some other folks, Leela Pike, she's an engineer, and she's really, I feel like, been at the forefront of looking at flood vulnerability assessments throughout the state of Maine. And then we also have Dan Bannon, who's also an engineer, and he is our coastal practice leader at GEI. And he is really great engineer when you're looking at coastal structures and how to adapt these structures for the future. So again, a great team. So just a quick kind of roadmap of where we're going. So we're already at the welcome and introductions. Going to give a brief project overview, going to dive into, here's our presentation. We want to hear from you. So that's the point of this meeting. So, we can work in our office behind our desks, look at the data and the science, but really what matters is coming to the community, hearing what's important to you. Many of you maybe have lived here for a long time and have seen these changes over the years. And so we want to hear what are maybe some strategies that you've thought of, what's important to you as a community, so that we can take that information in concert with our data and our science and our map of our flood vulnerability maps and come up with sort of a ranking criteria. So we can prioritize the different community assets, and then we can kind of look at the next steps. And again, as was mentioned, these are, not cheap projects to think about. So you really want to prioritize and then look at the funding options. And then again, we'll have some questions and answers. Just kind of a little brief, what's all this stuff on the back there. So we've just kind of sectioned out the waterfront and the project area focus. There was some unfortunate challenges with the printing, and it didn't quite come out exactly how we wanted it to look. But what the intent is for you to kind of maybe on your way out, or when we take a short break, but I don't think we'll have time, but just take it at some time on your way out, I think makes the most sense. And look at the waterfront, look at the aerial. And if you have a specific area that's important to you, take a Post-it note and write, why is this important? And, or if you have an idea about adaptation, write down that idea. And so we can hear from you. So what are we here for? And I just want to make a note. It's January 13th, a year ago, you all witnessed incredible flooding on the third storm, within a very short matter of time. And so I just, when we planned this, I noted I didn't even think of the date, but it's just really ironic to be here tonight. And so some of these images were provided to us, and these are from January 10th, so it's just unbelievable. So what we're looking at, the project goals are just basically a broad risk of the flooding, the exposure to the community facilities that are along the waterfront. We want to look at different time horizons because, we think of the future, but what does the future mean? Tomorrow is the future. So we want to think about near term. What are some things we can do in the near term, midterm? So kind of going out 20, 30 years. And then we want to go future because, generations to consider. And so we want to think about adaptation strategies that are be more on a long-term scale. We want to get the community feedback to understand those priority areas within our project focus. And then our intent at GEI, with again, our team of scientists and engineers, is to look at some general adaptation strategies. But then once we hear from the town, what we want to do is sort of focus in and look at 3 maybe more specific plans that we can, a high-level concept plan that we could develop for different assets along the waterfront. We're going to put this all together into our report. So what have we been doing? Basically, the city of Belfast has actually done a lot of groundwork. There was a study done in 2019 that looked at Penobscot Bay and several communities around Penobscot Bay. And so there was a lot of data that was collected as part of that study. So we've been reviewing the background information, these reports, the breakwaters. There's been some different studies done on the breakwater and some recommendations from a consulting firm as far as what could the city look at to address some of the flooding issues related to the breakwater. We came up in December and we walked the project area to, really get a firsthand look. Again, you can look at all the pictures, and although a picture is worth 1,000 words, what's even more valuable is being on the ground and really seeing, these pictures of the flooding and then seeing, oh, look at what the city did here to repair that. Is that something that you want to do as a city? That's not, is that an adaptation strategy? Or, and just understanding how people use the area. Then, we're taking that data and we have a good handle on, the information that we have. And if there was any additional needs that we need for information, we're at a good point. And then Elon and his team have been doing some of the flood scenario modeling. So we've kind of come together and said, what do we, what are the terms of this modeling? What do we want to look at as far as, again, the future, short term, near term, and longer term? We model this after the Maine Climate Council's recommendations. So they have just recently updated their sea level rise projections this year, or well, 2024, I should say. And so we're basing what those sea level rise projections are on both a intermediate and a longer term projection using those values. We're also considering storm surge. So, what we witnessed last January, you may see some of these inundation maps, and Elon can certainly touch more upon this when he speaks about the flood modeling, but, you're going to see inundation and think, well, that, or it doesn't show inundation. You're like, well, I saw last January that was inundated. And so you kind of look at, well, in addition to just these flood boundaries, you have to take into account the storm surge, the wave action. And then we have put this into these proposed flood scenarios. So there's different elevations that we consider. So there's the 100-year storm, and that was what you witnessed last January. That was when we look at these flood maps that we'll sort of pass around the room. You can see the current day 100-year flood inundation boundary is almost exactly what was on the ground last January. But we look at that from the 100-year, again, near term, midterm, and then longer term, and then also from a highest astronomical tide. So those are the tides that you see usually twice a year. So this is something that's going to be a yearly, you almost can guarantee these, elevations versus the 100-year, you have a 1% chance a year that you're going to see that, although that's becoming more common. Again, we're going to identify what assets are important and what are most vulnerable to flooding, and then come up with some of those adaptation strategies. So the project focus area is along the waterfront. We're starting down at the boathouse. I'm just working south, moving north, but yeah, starting down at the boathouse, looking at Heritage Park, the breakwater, the harbor master office, the boat ramp, the harbor walk, and going all the way up to the footbridge. We have included the wastewater treatment plant in this based on our inundation maps. There's I talk a lot doom and gloom sometimes, but there are some, highlights in this. And while there is some concerns related to that, it's not looking as though in the near term, it's something that's going to be inundated with floodwaters. So, but we have included that as part of our project area. So, just to kind of, again, a picture speaks 1,000 words. And so just kind of, why are we here? Maybe you weren't here in January, didn't witness it firsthand, or but this is just sort of a Google Street View image of the boathouse area. And there we are in January, just seeing the overtopping and the debris in the parking lot. As we move kind of north, this is a photograph that I took from our December site walk, and just kind of trying to find images that I had from the flooding. And you can see the tree as sort of your reference point, and just the amount of water that has come up. And, again, the aftermath was the repairs the city had to do to maintain that as a walkway. The harbor master's office and the breakwater, just the amount of water that's overtopping that area, is just unbelievable. And so here again was a picture from this past December. And then this is moving further north along the walkway and Front Street Boatyard there. And it's just, you can see the amount of water. And even we started our walk at a lower tide, but even the water, it's quite high. By the time we got this far, it's not that far north of the project area. But again, just an overwhelming amount of water. And it's, the destruction that you see on these docks, the business that was affected with flooding, another business. And then I just took some, headlines that I had seen in just newspapers. It's Belfast waterfront experiences Saturday storm flooding, Durds flooding, damages, debris washed ashore, worst I've ever seen. Belfast City Wharf temporary closed due to flooding, heavy damage along coastline as ocean inundates with powerful surf. So, again, a lot of us lived that last January. And so it's, here we are a year later, and, I think, this is commendable to the city for getting the funding, reaching out and getting this going so that we have a plan in place to adapt to some of this. So I'm going to turn this over to Elon to talk about a bit about the flood scenario modeling and what goes into the maps that we'll, again, pass around.
I can pass them out then.
Yeah.
Can everybody hear me in the back? Amazing.
Do you want to?
Yeah, you can do the slides.
That's okay.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different components of the flood scenarios. The first thing we look at is sea level rise, where we're going to be looking at intermediate and high rates of sea level rise. This is based off of the Maine Climate Council, the MCC's recommendations for sea level rise. They base their projections for sea level rise on NOAA science, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they recommend that we commit to manage an intermediate rate of sea level rise. So this is a rate of sea level rise that we can pretty confidently say is going to happen. These projections are very accurate going out into the future, and that we should probably prepare for a high rate of sea level rise. So we might not necessarily see this rate, but it's likely given the rate of sea level rise as it increases into the future. We'll also be looking at two different flood scenarios across the sea level rise projections, the highest astronomical tide, which is, we call that HAT for short. You might also know of it as the king tide. It's the highest predicted astronomical tide at a specific tide station. So there's a tide station we looked at in Belfast, so we're able to know exactly what that is in the city. And then we're also going to look at the 1% annual chance storm. You might have heard it as the 100-year storm. That's a storm that has a 1 in 100 chance of happening every single year. So some people think that's a storm that happens every 100 years. Technically, it could happen every year, but you have a 1% chance of it happening every year. And we're going to look today in the present day, we're going to look at 2050, 2070, and 2100, so we can get a full sense of the risk facing Belfast now and into the future. So these are the sea level rise scenarios presented by the Maine Climate Council, MCC. They originally released recommendations in 2020, but they just released new recommendations based on new science from NOAA in 2024, which is what we'll be using. If you'd seen the 2020 recommendations, you might have seen that their prepare to manage scenarios have been pushed out 20 years. So for example, in 2050, the original water surface elevation they were expecting was about 1.9 feet in the North American Vertical Datum of 1988, which we call NAVD88 for short. But the 2024 projections push that back 20 years. That's not to say that elevation won't happen. It's just going to happen a little bit later than we expected. So we picked out water surface elevations from 2050, 2070, and 2100 to help us with this planning study. So what goes into storm surge? What goes into the water levels that we see during a storm? So during your daily life, walking out, seeing low and high tide, we'll call that normal high tide means that's what you see during high tide. That's on a normal day with no storms. When storms come in, the atmospheric pressure drops and the sea level rises because there's less pressure pushing down on the water. Offshore winds from the storm will then push more water further inland, and that creates what we call a still water elevation. So we're not considering any waves, it's just the still water from the drop in atmospheric pressure and waves. So last year's storm, we would call that the 1% still water elevation because that was the still water elevation for a 1% chance storm, the 100-year storm. So the inundation boundaries that we look at in this study are the still water elevation. We're not considering any waves in the maps that you'll see. Later in the project, we will do some wave modeling and we'll be able to see, we have that still water elevation, where are waves then going to splash further inland? So we will be considering that. So this is a table of the kind of the combined flood scenarios. We're looking at 8 flood scenarios in total. HAT, the king tide, and the 100-year still water, so the storm surge value. For the existing time frame, 2050, 2070, and 2100. And you'll see that the values vary from 7.5 feet to 13.7 feet. And we're using sea level rise values of commit to manage. So the values that the Maine Climate Council has told us will almost certainly happen, so we should commit to manage those. I do want to kind of give a caveat. This is a trend, a sea level rise trend line from the Bar Harbor gauge. And as you can see, the sea level is rising, but every year it goes up and down. So we might say we're going to plan for 9 feet of water for a 100-year storm in 2050. But what you might actually measure is probably not going to be exactly 9 feet. It might be more, it might be less. But as you know, during the day, tides rise and fall. Same thing will happen in the future with sea level rise and storms. It's not going to match up perfectly to the values we're using. These values are just benchmarks to help us plan for the future. I'm going to hand it back over to Lisa.
Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, Belfast has done some work. In 2019, there was a study done along a more concentrated section of the harbor. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm nervous. So this was done, and you can see the area highlighted in red was the focus of that study. But what was great is that we have that elevation data for the wharf, floating docks, harbor master's office, vendor office, fuel storage building, breakwater, the shoreline protection, so some of the riprap, and the boat ramp. And that means we don't need to reinvent the wheel, which is great. And so taking some of that data, what we have now done is kind of expanded it out as I showed. And so we're going all the way up to the footbridge down to the boathouse. So where we can pick up additional data that we need is through the main office of GIS. They have the roads. We looked at walking paths elevations, if there's any registered tanks in the project area, any remediation sites. We also can get the boathouse and the footbridge too as part of our project area. And so this is a bit of an example of something that you're going to see in the report. And so what this shows is you've laid out the different assets that are along the waterfront, and then using those different flood scenarios that we talked about, the near term, midterm, and long term, and then using the two different the highest astronomical tide, and then the 100-year, we have these laid out in the table form. So just to take the boat ramp as an example. So for current day, the existing hat elevation is 7.5. When you look at the boat ramp, what you'll see is that it's going to be inundated about 1/2 foot when you have that hat tide. As you move to 2050, you're going to see 2 feet. And then again, the Harbor's Master's Office, 1.3 feet. If you look at the 100-year, which is what, again, that was what last January was, you can kind of get a sense of what the modeling is showing. It's showing that the boat ramp would be inundated by a little under 3 feet. Harbor Master's Office is 2. Again, this isn't like if you went out there with a stick on those dates, you might think, no, that was much deeper. And so this is just, not taking into account the wave action that maybe you saw. So this is what we have to look at when we think about, when we want to prioritize our assets, what is going, that is essential for town services, city services, and then what is most at risk. And so we can kind of help to hone in on what's important. And then also what Elon has done is looking at the roads that are potentially going to be inundated and inaccessible. A lot of communities where we work, what we're seeing is, you have a roadway that's inundated and that cuts off emergency access for, could be hundreds of people potentially. And so I will say again, getting out of the doom and gloom of all this, Belfast, where our project focus area is, and just the way of the topography of the city, we have very critical assets along the waterfront, but from an emergency service perspective, there's no houses that, you might displace hundreds of people, like residential apartment buildings. And so we do have some inundation of roads that we do need to consider. But I think that when we kind of, think about adaptation strategies, there's some solutions out there that I think will still maintain essential city functions. It's I will say you're in better shape than some communities with regard to roads, at least. So we have copies of the maps, and I'm going to show what taking all of this data and putting it into our model. This is what we present. This was the 100-year storm. This is current day. And you can see, some of these areas, again, thinking back to January for those folks that were down on the water, you can kind of see that these areas were inundated. Now, again, what you're seeing with this building, it's looking like it's covered in water. That's, this is where the floodwaters, elevation wise, are expected to come up. It's not as though that building's going to be underwater. So, and then this is looking at the 100-year storm at 2050. Again, you can see now as we take into account the Maine Climate Council's recommendations for sea level rise, this is what we're looking at for inundation. And again, keep in mind, those are not underwater buildings, but that is the level of floodwater. This is 2070 100-year storm. And then here's 2100 100-year storm. So you look at this and you can say, we need to do something. We need to figure out what we need to do to keep Belfast, a waterfront community, and keep it here for generations to enjoy like past generations have. So what do we do? So we are going to look at the assets, and we kind of had that listed table that I've shown you of just some of the community publicly owned buildings, and that's our focus of our list of assets. Not to say that the businesses that are, you know, around can't take some of these adaptation strategies and consider them as well in their planning. But what we want to do is, how do we prioritize? So first is, how exposed is that asset to flooding? Is it a concern? How many people can be impacted? Are there critical facilities impacted? What is the asset's economic and cultural significance? I think a lot of times, you know, we think economics, but I live in South Portland, and I have to say, like, culturally or historic is sometimes just as important. Last January, I will never forget, I was sitting at my son's basketball game, and my neighbor was like, look at this. And it was a video. And I don't know how many of you are maybe familiar with South Portland, but we have this beautiful little cove beach called Willard Beach. And on the southern end is a ledge outcrop with these two historic fishing shacks. And I have been going to Willard Beach for, you know, over 20 years, walking my dog, just like, I absolutely love that beach. And those fishing shacks, they did nothing. They were not economically significant in the least, but they were a part of that community and that beach. And just, you know, people would look at them and get the sunset pictures or sunrise pictures. And they just made it kind of what it is in some ways. And so looking at this video at my son's basketball game of the floodwaters just washing up and just completely ripping those off of their pilings and just washing them out to sea. And it was devastating. I mean, it took away a bit of Willard. And, you know, there was a lot of community talk about, do we rebuild? What do we do? You know, and you know, it's just a sad reality of, you know, they were old buildings, but they had a lot of significance for a lot of people. So when we think about, you know, the maps in the back, and when you're thinking about what's important to you, you know, it doesn't just have to be economic. It can be, you know, again, historic. Like, your daughter got married at the boathouse. It's just very important to me for this reason. You know, I want to, you know, hear from the community. And then, you know, we have to live in reality too, with what has the best opportunity for adaptation. You know, again, with funding being important to consider, we want to make sure that if we're going to do this, let's, again, prioritize based on the community's, you know, value to something, to an asset, and then also, like, what has a likely chance of actually making a difference. So how do we do this? There's different ways for adapting. And so these are just kind of a general, and I'll get into some more specifics with this, but basically no response. Let's just put our head in the sand and just forget about it. That is one way to handle this. And in some cases, maybe that does make the most sense for, you know, an area that, you know, is green space, or, you know, maybe there's just nothing you do in that area. Although there are really great innovative techniques that you're seeing in some of these green spaces and parks. Advanced, this is not a viable option. It's just included because of this graphic. But this is where you would actually kind of build up against the water. I mean, from a regulatory perspective, that's just not something I think that we're gonna ever see. But it's on this list. But I just made a note, it's not a viable option. So let's maybe put that off the table. Protection. So we actually just kind of leave a structure or an asset in place. And then what we do is build something to protect it. You know, this is your retaining walls. This is your riprap, your breakwaters that you see. Retreat. This would be actually taking a building and, you know, if you had the land, let's say, and you wanted to move back outside of the flood inundation boundary, do that. That's an option. This can also be something like we're seeing in communities around the country, like a municipal buyback program, or FEMA has a buyback program where, you know, it's basically that they'll give you a certain percentage of your home's value, and then you just, there's different details, and there's no, you know, one policy how it is, but it's just, again, it falls under retreat. Accommodation. So this is basically, again, leaving your building in place, but maybe making some changes like elevating the building on piles. You could do some sort of flood proofing. This can also just be zoning changes, which I'll talk a little bit about. Offshore techniques as well. And then ecosystem-based adaptation. So these are living shorelines, living seawall, permeable surfaces. Some examples, Boston is actually doing a really great resiliency project where it's basically kind of considered a floodable green space. So I think about Heritage Park would be a great opportunity where you have this green space. You don't have a structure like a building that's maybe like a critical asset for services. And then what you have is the walkway that goes along. You know, you can design it to be where it can more absorb the floodwaters and then outfall back into the ocean, something like that, so that, you know, you're not constantly repairing the pavement because you keep getting the flooding and it's, you know, damaging the asphalt every storm.
SLR.
Sea level rise. Yeah, sorry, good question. This is something that's happening in Portland. So they've just went through a big zoning change, and they're identifying areas that are, it's called coastal flood resilience overlay zones. So these areas, kind of like what we're seeing along the water, maybe they would identify that as a coastal flood resilience overlay zone. So they're putting in some different types of restrictions if you were to do any sort of, you know, certain percentage of your building were to be redeveloped, let's say. They've identified certain exempt activities like a marine use, parking, lobbies, storage. If it's less than a certain size, you're exempt. You don't need to elevate it. You can rebuild. Number 2 is non-critical. So this would be commercial, retail, food and beverage, self-storage, where you do need to elevate it, but it's only a certain height. And then you have critical, where this is a critical service to the community. It's a residential, it's homes for people, it's medical, it's schools, daycare, government offices. And what they have done is the BFE, that's called the base flood elevation. And that comes out through the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And they basically, do modeling every so often, and they come up with this is the flood elevation. And so then they come, when you're going to rebuild, if you're in a certain flood zone, like a V zone, you have to elevate above that. Well, Portland has gone a step further and has come up with a design flood elevation. So if you're a critical use and you're in the design flood elevation, or you're in the coastal flood overlay zone, then you have to elevate even higher. And it's 1 foot above the predicted future flood level. So that is done because, again, when you look at these flood inundation boundaries, they want to avoid that these are out of service during critical times. And so that's just one way that you're seeing adaptation. It doesn't always have to be a revetment or, you know, a massive structural change. It can be sort of a cost-effective change that helps protect future generations. But there are structural measures, which are important too in the, there's a lot of, there's no one size fits all. And so what we see here are a permanent flood barrier, which you have the breakwater. And there has the study that was done several years ago offered 3 recommendations. One was to just re-elevate it in place up to, I think it was 3.9 feet. Another option for the breakwater that they recommended was you elevate it, but then also extend it out. And then the third was similar to that. It was just a different type of material, and then also have some additional floating docks. So those are flood barriers that certainly work. The seawalls, as we walked along the site, you can see the riprap that's there. Thinking about that, do you elevate the riprap? Do you add in plantings? And there's a lot of options. Wet and dry flood proofing. So this would be basically designing like a wet flood proofing would be that in New England, we all have basements, and in the basement, you have so many utilities. So when your basement floods, it's really problematic. Wet flood proofing would be that you may still have like a crawl space or something, and it's kind of designed that if flood water gets in there, it's not going to impact the functioning of that building. Dry flood proofing would be more like putting up a barrier to keep the water out. Flood adaptive materials. So this would be something like when we walked along the water, we saw the area that was of the walkway that was completely rebuilt. And we're actually working with Castine, and they had, the town dock this past January was completely destroyed. They built that with what's called through flow decking. So it's basically holes in the decking, and it's like a composite material. And that allows the water to kind of come up so that it's not, banging up and trying to rip stuff up. So those are some things to think about. If you're going to be rebuilding structures, what can we do that's going to have a longer life term and be more adaptive to when we see these flood inundation boundaries? And then we have kind of I wouldn't say pie in the sky. I mean, it kind of is. There's nothing in Maine that's been done, but it's called a wave attenuation device, so a WAD. These are it can be different types of materials, but you're basically putting something offshore. You see these more in sort of beach areas down in southern areas where you're getting this wave action coming ashore. And so you basically almost put something that's going to help break up that energy from the waves and just basically dissipate the energy so it's not slamming up on the shore. These have not been permitted in Maine. We have been in communication with DEP on some maybe like pilot projects that we thought. We just haven't found the right site, and it's a very expensive endeavor too. So I'm curious to see, because you hear more and more as as we are dealing with flooding issues. Again, you kind of have to have everything on the table at this point to say, what's going to stick and what's going to work. Non-structural or green infrastructure. So this could be a flood warning system. You see the water, you see in 2100, how much of that is inundated. Could you, ensure that you're getting people out of that area so that they're to safety? You can have some sort of design flood emergency warning system. It sounds, the next step here for this community is the hazard mitigation plan, but, coming up with some sort of being sure that you're prepared. High water rescue vehicle, temporary barriers, temporary flood walls, and I'll show you some images of what I'm speaking of with that. Again, I talked about the municipal buyout, or FEMA has a program, a rent back program, and that would fall under that retreat. A living seawall. This is a bit new, and this isn't necessarily as related to flood adaptation, but my background, I was at the DEP for almost 8 years, and I did a lot of permitting, and we see a lot of, there's older retaining walls, these vertical walls along the water, which they don't permit those anymore for a number of reasons. But one being, the energy as the wave comes up is just hitting a vertical structure and it's going to where the end of the wall is. So you're just sort of passing the problem on to your neighbor. But also you have this vertical structure that is taking away habitat. And so you have a breakwater, you already have that in place, you're grandfathered. And let's say the city wanted to elevate it, there's can be issues permitting wise, like how is this going to impact the environment? This is something new I just saw down in Boston area. It's from Stone Living Lab, but it's a living seawall that they have installed, and it's kind of artistic. I mean, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but this allows so when you have this vertical structure that's essentially taking away habitat, it kind of allows the habitat to come back and grow. Again, it's not necessarily as linked to flood, but I think it's just, again, it's an interesting, and we're seeing a lot of innovative techniques. So this is just one. The artificial reef system, that's kind of similar to the wave attenuation device, where you're basically putting in like a reef ball. It's anything that's just going to break up that energy, so it's not just pushing on shore, direct hit. Once you have a structure in place and it hits it, it'll dissipate the energy, and you'd have like a row of these balls that would do that. So it helps to minimize what you're seeing in the upland area. So these are just some temporary flood protection measures, these flood logs that you would put in place before a storm, deployable flood barriers, tiger dams. There's actually someone down in Scarborough Beach, if you ever get down there this winter, that they've kind of not quite installed to this extent, but it's a homeowner down there, and you basically can fill these tubes with sand, put it in front of your property. And these people in particular live internationally in the winter. So Popham Beach was not, they got hit Scarborough Beach got hit extremely hard last winter. And so this kind of gives them the somewhat reassurance that their property will be protected. And then from like a regulatory permitting perspective, it's temporary. It's pretty much out of the way. So if you kind of put it in, you're just using sand from the environment. And I was talking to the contractor, actually, he was pretty impressed with the durability of this. So that was, something to consider for, these are temporary measures that you'd, maybe in your hazard mitigation plan or your emergency preparing plan that you would kind of think about. HESCO baskets, again, similar, they're filled with sand, they're collapsible when they're not in use. But this is a new one, just wanted to bring to the attention. And this is coming out of the University of Maine, their composite center. It's a temporary, rapidly deployable breakwater. I just think is really cool. It's, again, not been used in the state. It's in development. But if anyone has any interest in just, some of this technology, I just would, invite you to look at their website because they're doing some really innovative, interesting things with composites, culverts and bridges. But this one, again, has not been put in place. So we don't have an example of how well it works, but we have to think big. And so this is one way of thinking big. This would be something, again, where you're just trying to break up that wave action before it hits shore and does a lot of the damage. And so this is something that you could put out in the water, a storm's coming or maybe a longer term. But this is through the University of Maine and it's the Maine Composite Center. So this is where we want to hear from you. We want to hear, have you been impacted by flooding? What assets are important to you? And what adaptation measures are you interested in? As part of this project, what GEI intends to do is develop a ranking matrix, essentially showing here's the assets, here's how vulnerable they are to flooding, here's what we heard from the community, and then we want to basically hone in on 3 specific adaptation strategies. So what I did tonight was just go over kind of general ideas from temporary to longer term, just some ideas. And then what we want to do is once we can target in on assets, we can kind of provide the city with some high level concept plans as something to consider for future planning efforts. And so just kind of, I have again, this image again, just the aerial of the waterfront. But from our site walk, this is just some of the notes that I took as I walked along the water. Here's the boathouse. This is an important community asset. It sounded like, you have a lot of weddings. It's used in the winter for various harbor master floats, building and so forth. Clearly an area of flooding. The retaining wall, I know there were some repairs done. And you can see from our inundation maps, it's an area that will be flooded. Bank erosion that we noted along that walkway. Again, this is an area that, again, thinking out loud, floodable green space, is that something that you could consider, where you have it more permeable? You could relocate the walkway that's directly along the water. This is a deed restricted area that was highlighted to us. So this is, again, there was definitely erosion along some areas there. But considering that there is some deed restrictions, that would be an area to, just kind of think through. You'd have to do a little more research on what is and isn't allowed. We did see bank erosion along this kind of inlet area there. And then the breakwater. We had the harbor master's office, the boat ramp. There was that working waterfront area that, again, probably pretty important to the community to consider and want to maintain. You have the gas diesel area for the docks. Again, the walkway that has been rebuilt, and then there was an erosion area on either side of the footbridge that we saw. Something that you want to consider, maybe a riprap revetment type of thing. And then, what are our next steps? And we will get to. I do want to hear from folks, but I'm just going to kind of go through this. But finalize our flood modeling. Identify those adaptation strategies and get into more specifics with different assets. Do the ranking matrix. We want to, again, come back to the community with here's what we've developed, and this will be more towards the end of our project. And then our final report to the city is due at the end of June. And so we want to have incorporated additional community feedback. So we do intend to have more. We haven't scheduled as a virtual workshop, but we're going to hopefully come back because I love Belfast, but it's just, I think, helpful to be in person too. So I do want to leave with, I'm not quite done yet, but I want to, this quote from Rachel Carson, I just think is really timely. The sea has always been a great teacher, showing us the importance of adaptability and resilience in the face of challenges. And I just think, she's a woman ahead of her time in some ways, but, we're living that. It really is teaching us. And I think we need to, be more adaptable. So I think what we can do now is we'll go ahead and pass out these flood maps, and we'll kind of, if you could circulate them around, they're grouped together by, again, the first page is meant, and you can, actually, Elon, can I just have a copy real quick? So they're all, they're different, and these were on the screen, and I'll put them up on the screen, those slides. But the first one you can see, I'm sorry, in the bottom right here, this is the current sea level. And then if you're wondering what you're looking at as far as the flood inundation boundary goes, then you can see here's 2050 in the bottom right, 2070 and 2100. So that's how you know what year you're looking at. And we can circulate them through, but they come in a pack of 4, basically.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Lisa,
Yeah.
comment.
Okay, let me, can we get the microphone? You'll repeat, okay. So,
Okay, let me put it back together.
so we have a quick comment from Jerry and,
Mike Life, yeah.
yeah,
A comment about everything's around water levels, flood levels. There's 2 major tide gauges, official NOAA tide gauges in the state.
Or
And from 3.
Yeah.
Well, Bar Harbor,
Bar Harbor,
Portland,
and Eastport.
yeah. And from those tide gauges, they use those tide gauges to prepare forecasts for tides.
Mhm.
We have unofficial tide gauges, 2 different tide gauges with 3 different measurement techniques that have been installed in the harbor here with the best attempt to calibrate them. The notable thing is that both the timing and the level are consistently off from the projected tide, predicted tide, I should say. And it's not a small effect. It's in the order of a half a foot or more.
Wow.
And so everything we're saying here, half a foot is significant.
Yeah,
And then the other comment was around tidal frequency. Portland defined waterfront structures as exempt.
yeah,
And that's all fine and good. In other words, you can accept some level of flooding. The problem here is when the flooding gets common enough where the structure is no longer useful, i.e., let's say several days a month now, our parking lot floods or our wharfs are underwater.
Mhm.
That begins to affect the usefulness for business.
thank you. Yeah, and again, just to highlight Portland, like, that's just an example of something that's being done in a community. And I think, yeah, it's important for Belfast to, if that was something that they wanted to consider, like, really consider making it your own and what's important. And right, I mean, Portland being, there's so many waterfront structures, and working waterfront's a big part of, the city down there, with the wharves and so forth. So I think they wanted to be accommodating.
There is a database for our flood gauges, our tide gauges, by the way.
Okay, that's great. So how do you, well, I can talk, but, oh, okay, can I get permission?
I understand this correctly.
Oh, we're good.
Your solutions or your proposed solutions will not be the same thing for the entire boathouse to the bridge, correctly?
Correct.
So in other words, you'll take the Heritage Park, they'll have this thing that water comes in, flows back out, et cetera. So you'll have various options that you'll think are the most attainable. And then, I find that the honeycomb design on there be quite interesting, because stuff will obviously fill in there and give that.
Yeah.
I find it quite interesting. I've worked with living shorelines in the past, which I think would be a good start in the area adjacent to the breakwater. We do the bonfire, which we receive, and the amount of space that's now left on the quote beach is quite small.
Yeah.
And if you go back and look at some of the videos, even from 17, you can see how much more sand there is. Now, when you look at area 2, there's a lot of large gray rock. That's not indigenous rock. That's stuff that was brought in, and I think that was whacked around last January. But possibly putting 4 logs in and getting them down for the cement castles that lock together, which you could also consider doing spat on those, oyster spat on those, but that runs into a whole other thing with closed water and oysters being available. Something.
Yeah.
I think the Living Shoreline would put back, this is a cultural thing, the beach Which a lot of people come down during the summer, use that area and the area, the beach adjacent to the boathouse. Quite well used.
Yeah, this is great. This is exactly what we want to hear, like hearing from you and, these ideas. So, we're making notes tonight. This is recorded, but yeah, if anyone has any other, that kind of information, yeah.
I think at the.
Wait, real quick, if you want your question to be on the recording, you have to speak into the mic.
Oh,
I can do that.
On the opposite end of that, where the footbridge is also a pretty essential resource. I mean, people are there all the time. And I have noticed that you talked about that as a point of erosion. And in fact, it's not planted properly. There is a bird habitat there just beyond.
mhm.
And that would be something like a pretty quick down and dirty mitigation, just to come in there, get rid of the Japanese knotweed, plant it out properly with grasses. And that would be a way, at least one down dirty, quick one that you could show that you're making progress.
Yeah.
And you're volunteering to do it.
Yeah.
That will be right after I finish the tree.
My question has to do with the sewer plant. I know in the slides that you presented, it sort of shows it on the outside of protected
Yeah.
areas.
Mhm.
On the other hand, they're very close. When there's a lot of water, what goes into the sewer plant has to come out. We have a number of pump stations around the bay. I'm wondering if in all of your work, you're taking into consideration what happens when they have to release those systems into the bay and how that could damage the living organisms in the bay.
Yeah, and we were actually just talking about that, but go ahead, I'll let Elon take this one on the way up here.
Yeah, so while we're not too concerned with the physical structures themselves, as you said, there's a lot of equipment kind of leading in and out of the treatment plant. So we're going to be looking at the elevations of the pipes and the pump stations that go in and out of the treatment plant to figure out how these inundation extents will affect that. I think we'll be working with Jerry to get some climate action plans for the treatment plant, so we'll be able to consider that in our evaluation.
One other thing that it just occurred to me, there's an enormous amount of impervious surface there. Parking lot that doesn't need to be there, et cetera, that probably should also be considered when you start thinking about this stuff.
Yeah, we did, that was highlighted on our site, the town-owned or city-owned parking area and kind of like what's happening with that area, so. Mm.
I think that's an interesting point about impervious surfaces, even the walkway. How important is it for, kids learning how to bike to have the tarmac along the side, or could we use some other surface material for that? My question is, your mandate is to look at public, or as you call them, community assets and planning for those. Obviously, there are private commercial assets that are part of this catchment area. And the question is, are your solutions going to be with that in mind, not to, in terms of free riders, but, will a particular solution benefit all of the assets in the area? And how do you distinguish between what has to be done using public funds and that which can be part of a consortium or a combined approach?
Yeah, I think when we think about it, at this point, we're kind of just starting to turn the page on, here's what the flooding looks like. And now tonight, again, what are the assets that are important? And then the next step are, what do we do to adapt to what are some strategies? And yeah, we're hearing feedback from the town, like, well, let's get our biggest bang for the buck. And like, this is a publicly owned area, but it'll also help protect, other private entities, like absolutely that should be on the table to consider. And that could be our focus area when we think about these concept plans, like, and where we want to focus that energy. So yeah, we're not ruling that out, but I think, you know, from the community perspective, we kind of are within the publicly owned areas for now. But also too, speaking of some of these strategies that we go through, I mean, hopefully this can help be like a roadmap for planning for those businesses that are affected. You know, here's some strategies to look at, and they can kind of start to think about that. And, you know, the state is, I mean, funding is always an issue, but they are hearing from people, particularly related to working waterfront. You know, one of the issues with last winter after the storms, there was some federal or state funding that came out for working waterfronts, but it was really like you had to have so many fishermen at that wharf. And so all these kind of smaller entities got left behind, and, you know, they're valuable too. And so I think the state's kind of, you know, doing what they can. Obviously, they don't have an endless pot of money, but, you know, this next round of the working waterfront is kind of helping to take in and hearing feedback of like, how can we address kind of the smaller scale working waterfront? I mean, that's one example, and there's other funding sources too, but just to kind of give you an example. But yeah, it's a good question.
So if I've understood this correctly, I think you said that the inundation studies are still water levels and not with wave action. So as you're thinking about adaptation strategies, how do you account for that storm surge wave action, which my understanding is that's what caused a great deal of the destruction?
So one of the challenges with these planning level studies with considering wave action is that wave action is very dependent on the topography. And when you have a kind of long shoreline with lots of different topography, it's hard to create to create a wave model that is accurate for the whole shoreline. So what we're likely to do is we're going to figure out which assets are most vital that we want to focus on, and then we can create a model specific to those locations along the shoreline that models the wave run up. So how high it splashes up and how far it goes inland. So we'll be able to conduct wave modeling. It'll just be for specific sites as opposed to the whole shoreline.
Elon, this is not a question from me, but a suggestion that many of us in the room will not be directly impacted by 2070 eventualities. And there may be some others in the back of the room that that will be around for that. I would love if you could persuade them to tell you what's important to them.
That's great.
I think that question was targeted at some of our audience members in the back. So is there anything I can say to encourage you to maybe ask a question? We don't bite, right? Nobody bites. I can tell you what motivated me to be here. When I was in high school, I had a chemistry teacher that told me that it was my responsibility to make an impact on the world. She didn't tell me what the impact had to be, but I knew it had to be something. And I always told myself I could, make a toy that puts a smile on a kid's face, so I could, build a bridge that helps people get to work every single day. So that's why I'm here today, after many, many years of education. But I'm here because I want to help people out and, make the world a better place than when I left here. And are you guys in high school? So maybe if there's something that a teacher said that inspired you to be here today, even if it's just for a grade, because I definitely did things for a grade before, but sometimes that's the push you need.
You need the microphone? Yeah.
Oh, it's your chemistry
Really?
teacher. I love chemistry teachers.
So I guess one of the things, well, we're all here. There's three there, right there, and then us three back here. One of the things that is really interesting to me, I guess, is the idea of like the green or I don't know, floodable green space. Yeah, exactly. And like, we were wondering, like, so I guess, how would, if you had like a park, for example, like, would that be attainable? As how effective would it be to be like create, so I don't know, for example, like the commons down by the boathouse, if it was transformed into like a more like trees and green growth park, how effective would that be to keep I guess I don't really know how to, I'm asking, but if you can
deal with the water.
exactly,
basically. Yeah, I mean, you're not going to stop the water from coming, certainly. But I think like you're on the right track with like yeah, could you plant some additional vegetation along the top there? Because that helps, with erosion along the bank that you're seeing. But then you do have all that entire, lawn area. And as we saw in some of those images, I mean, the water's just going right over top. And so, like I said, I mentioned in Boston, they're doing this, it's a massive project, but it's all about making these parks, and not just in Boston, but across the globe, floodable so that you still keep your green space, but you're basically working with the water now instead of trying to fight against it and put up, these types of structures that are just trying to keep it out. It's not like again, it's an expensive, it's engineering, but it's an idea. And I think it's something, how important this is, if that's a focus area, then it's something that maybe the city can look, again, long-term. Maybe it's not a temporary flood term option that we're, categorizing as that, but I think that's great. And I really appreciate hearing. Yes.
Yeah, is there some consideration on maybe looking on is there some consideration of maybe looking on the east side of the harbor as well? If you're talking like a breakwater or something to stop the flow or the waves coming in?
So this study for us was the project focus area was designated, I think, by the funding. And I think Joellen maybe can speak to that.
Right. So the funding that we received was specific to this specific geography. And so what we're hoping to do is use this as an example and a jumping off point to look at other areas within the city. So it's not like want to exclude both private owned land and other areas of Belfast. So we're looking to the consultant to give us a pathway forward and next steps. The city has done a lot of work related to the breakwater. They're currently wrapping up a sedimentation study that was related to the 3 options that were mentioned earlier. Elevating it and extending it may cause some impacts within the harbor, and making sure you're not within the federal channel for navigation. We know obviously Young's Lobster, that's a private owned, and they sustained a lot of damage in that last storm. And they were able to get some grants to help them get back up and running, as were some other businesses on the east side. And so we know there's an impact. The water's coming and it's not going to just be in this area. It's not like we're funneling the water to that area. The Army Corps did several years ago look at a breakwater on the east side that would be hopefully protect the whole upland area. But the return on investment was not there. You couldn't build it for $30 million and get your the federal government to pay for it. So unfortunately, we're going to have to do multiple actions in lots of different areas to protect lots of areas and assets in the city. It's not, there's no one size fits all, as you mentioned. There's no one, silver bullet. So we're looking at moving the ball forward and doing small projects and, hope that we don't continually have the 1% storms every month. So we're hedging our bets, but we're doing the best we can with the funding. There is a lot we're tracking, the city's tracking a lot of the funding is coming out with the new Maine Won't Wait plan that was adopted in 2024. And so the governor has just initiated new legislation for new action related to resilience and both legislative, so new laws and new funding. And so we're tracking that as a city to make sure we're getting our foot in the door for all those things. So it definitely will be a point that we should include in this plan, that we should be looking at other areas. We did see other impacts inland. There's rivers and streams elsewhere that feed into the river, the Passy River. the Public Works have done a great job in upscaling some of the culverts, so you're not seeing as much ponding on streets. So this is our primary focus area at this point. So I hope that answers your question.
If the park was to be turned into a floodable green space, what would that look like would there be open spaces and pathways still?
Yes, that would be the intent. Yeah, I wish I had actually, it's good to conclude what an image is when you hear floodable green space. What does that even mean? But yeah, I mean, it's essentially a park. And I mean, you could have different features in there, like a vegetation island of trees, or, there's no, again, I keep saying this, but one size fits all. I mean, it would be, first of all, you'd have to look at like the flooding and look at the model, and then kind of work with where the water, you're seeing it come to, and then you could engineer it. And there's no, sky's the limit with the design of that. It's more about the materials that you're, instead of just having grass compacted down, or with the asphalt, you could do something like porous pavement, which allows the water to flow through. And then it's like a stormwater management feature. And then, the lawn area, again, you could have the subgrade would be more infiltrating down in, and then you could kind of daylight the water out. But yeah, you would still keep it the idea would be to keep it as a park and usable for the uses that you see now.
In the park you're describing, when it's flooded, wouldn't that kill any green, like grass or plants that it touches?
Well, that was what we would design for. So, but no, I mean, there are salt tolerant vegetation that you could have within there. And then the idea is like the water moves pretty quickly through there. But yeah, no, it'd still be.
It doesn't kill it automatically.
Correct, right. And those are, those are some things to think about too. I mean, none of these adaptation strategies that we talked about are kind of set it and forget it. They do require maintenance, I think, as you can see with like just the riprap along the park. You're starting to get the top of bank erosion as the water washes out there. So, some things sure are less maintenance than others. But when we look at some of these green, living shoreline, those do require a higher level of maintenance than maybe just putting in riprap or vetment. So again, that's just a consideration I want to highlight, not to say it's a reason to not consider it, but it's, again, a maintenance cost. And,
If you think about what makes Belfast, one of the major things is its incredible access to the water. That whole mile from Steamboat up to the walking bridge is something you really don't find in other communities. And I'm out and about a lot, walking my dog up and down that strip. It's really a long, linear, 1 mile long park that thousands of people use. Steamboat Landing, the park right there in the summer when they have Belfast summer nights, when they have some bands there, up to 1,000 or more people are using that. Hundreds of people are walking from the bridge up and down all the time. It's a critical thing, but it's something that when it floods, you could take a day off from being there, but it needs to be something that can live with the waters coming and going. And so my bet would be that's a good spot to really focus on.
I want to make one comment. The terms of the study were that it could be applied to public land, not private. The east side of the harbor, for the most part, is private land. Having said that, the thing that's the east side of the harbor has going for it, if you look at the GIS maps, it's steeper. So the most vulnerable area is really on the west side, which is where all of the, infrastructure is located. So the other, I guess I'll let it go at that.
I just have a brief comment that I haven't heard anyone talk about siltation of the bay or the harbor area. We live a few houses down from the boathouse, and we lost a big chunk of the backyard, and it all went out into the bay. And I know siltation and maintaining the channel and all that is really important. So maybe it's not part of this discussion, but that's just something I think about a lot because I don't want all this soil going out into the harbor. And a lot of it is fill too. We had a soil scientist who came by through the county soil and water conservation services. And the guy was really brilliant and was making some good suggestions about how to keep your soil on your land. And we spent the summer planting, I don't know, probably 100 plants, lots of juniper and grasses and things that with deep roots to try and hold the soil left. Because what used to be like a gentle slope is now a cliff in our backyard. And we're going to try and do it that way. Anyway, just
Yeah, no, it's
thinking
a
about
great
soil
point.
infiltration.
Yeah, and it's you know, something from a regulatory perspective as well. You know, so much erosion. I mean, erosion is a natural process, but the level that we're seeing it, particularly in areas with shellfish beds, you know, it's basically suffocating some of those. But then you have, you know, if you were putting in a riprap revetment, you want to ensure that you're not cutting off a sediment supply either, because that is important. So you kind of have to maintain that balance. But yeah, I hear you with the just a level of amount of sediment that's, you know, going into our waterways is not healthy. And it's, you know, it's a little more excessive, I think, than Mother Nature, you know, may have intended. But yeah, when like thinking of some of the living shoreline and, you know, those ideas, I mean, yeah, again, we're looking at it from the community, but those are, again, residential. Those are things that if not just putting in riprap revetment, you can kind of put in core matting and planting to kind of help hold that soil back. And again, these are part of the adaptation strategies of the report that we'll kind of have as our sort of overarching ones. And then you can, you know, use those as you see fit for private residential as well.
I think you asked about prioritizing sections and Steamboat Landing, as he mentioned. That is like the crucial asset to me along that whole waterfront to prioritize, in my estimation, first because of the amount of different events that are held there. And so that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you.
I think you guys have done a great job kind of laying out the list, the menu of options that we kind of have at our disposal. I just want to make sure I'm clear on what is going to be provided when we gather again in June. It sounds like you're going to look at a handful of assets and then come up with the 2 or 3 potential solutions per asset that you think would make the most sense. Is that?
No, not per
Okay.
asset.
Okay.
So what we're gonna have general adaptation strategies.
Mhm.
And then what we want to do is, you know, hearing feedback is focus in on 3 assets and then look at adaptation strategies for those 3 assets specifically. So not like, you know, a boathouse, here's 3 strategies here, waterfront, here's, you know, the steamboat park, you know, that's a bit outside of the scope of what our, you know, ability is with the timing of this and so forth. So, but we'll hone in on 3 adaptation strategies specific to these different assets. And that goes up like
Gotcha.
with Elon too, with the wave run-up model too. It's, you know, more beneficial to target in on a specific asset because it's not going to be as valuable, or I don't even, you know, the topography is so variable that it wouldn't be much value to look at the whole waterfront.
That makes a ton of sense. Thanks. And then can you just talk very briefly about, you know, how you approach cost benefit analysis and assessing those strategies?
Well, that's part of the ranking matrix too. I mean, because obviously, like we've talked about, funding is limited and it's not a bottomless, you know, pit. And so when we look at the ranking matrix, not only will we have, here's the assets that we heard from the community are valuable, here's the ones that are most vulnerable to flooding, here's the one, you know, some realistic adaptation strategies, but also, you know, here's the cost value that it would take to do this. And, you know, and that's kind of on the city. We're not going to have specific, like this is a
You're not going out and getting a-
$1.5 million, you know, but, you know, we'll have certainly a range of what the cost estimate is, basically broken down by low, medium, high, you know, and give you a range within that to consider. So that at least gives you again, sort of a roadmap to say, like, is this even from a financial feasible option too?
Great. Thanks.
Mhm. Oh, yeah, yeah.
Hi, my question, I guess the $64,000 question is, where is the funding going to come from to do some of this, especially in light of what might happen with federal and matching funds, which all could just disappear?
Absolutely.
NOAA could be defunded, DEP could be, they would be all gone. What could we do as a community to make up for that lack of money?
I mean, that is a, like you said, $64,000 question. I mean, it's an unknown. I mean, there's a lot of communities throughout the state going for these same, pots and of, funding to rebuild and plan for the future. And it's kind of a TBD. I don't know if Joellen wants to it sounds like, the city's really doing some great, keeping track of the funding. And like she mentioned, there's LD1. It's a new legislative initiative by the governor to kind of, in the context of resilience and municipal and homeowners, it's targeted at. So
I mean, are we not talking millions, tens of millions,
yes,
even hundreds of millions?
millions of dollars. Yeah.
The first step is to have a plan. So you can't get money without a plan. So that's our, it's just, you're not competitive. You don't know what you're doing. You can't talk to any of the funding agencies. And so this was important because the governor put this money out even before the storms for the Community Resilience Fund. And I think we have a very good administration in the state of Maine that is putting this and prioritizing these efforts, in addition to many other programs. But this is a high priority for the state of Maine. And so I think the state's going to work with municipalities and nonprofits and private property owners as well to make these changes happen. The federal government is not going to get defunded day one. There is money that we think is still going to be available through FEMA. FEMA is a pretty deep-pocketed agency. The city of Belfast is working with MEMA, the Maine Emergency Management, to get the hazard mitigation plan, which then would allow for us to funnel FEMA money into the city. We can't ask for money until we have the hazard mitigation plan. So again, it's really about making these steps and moving forward and getting all of our ducks in a row and making sure that we're there at the table asking with a plan, like a concrete plan. So this is really important because GEI they could come up with different adaptation strategies, but if that's not the priority for the city, then it doesn't do us any good. Like, to preserve a walkway is one thing, but to preserve Steamboat Landing in the walkway, the footbridge, the boat launch, which is really important as an economic asset for the city of Belfast. Kathy's in the back. That's our harbor master. It is one of the best boat launches in the mid-coast area, and it generates an enormous amount of economic benefit for the city of Belfast. We might be a small working waterfront, but the amount of recreation, tourist, and other boaters that come for our fuel depot is very important. So there's a lot of assets. And so we're just trying to make sure that we move those that are most important for short, medium, and long term are identified. So this is, that's kind of a great transition. I know there was another question, but that's kind of the next steps is moving that ball forward and coming up with something fairly quickly so that those funds can flow into Belfast. And we have a pretty good, solid city staff. Thomas Kittredge is amazing, 13 years of bringing millions of dollars into the city of Belfast. Bub and Alex from Planning and Codes are here. Like I said, Kathy, and we're all moving in the same direction. There is no, and Councilman Bitely was here. The city manager is out of the country, otherwise she would have been here. But we're all moving. The city is all moving in the same direction. That we don't have any opposition from any of the folks that are working on your behalf. So there was another question. Did you have a question? Okay.
Your comments sort of half answered it. When you said you were going to pick 3 locations and give recommendations, I became concerned listening to everyone's coveted love of the walkway and the footbridge, but there are economic drivers down there too, which is the boat launch and then the shipyard and a couple other things. So I don't know how you pick 3 in that area. I don't know if you consider that the wave height might be higher in one area or another, so that drives it. But I'm hoping maybe you can give us 3 in the background besides, so that we have all the variables considered, so that the city then can make a good decision.
That's great feedback. And yeah, I mean, you know, you kind of, with the time and effort that we have for this study, we have to focus, you know, and I think that's why, again, we want to hear from you. And I think our next steps too are to kind of reconvene with the committee, with Joe Ellen, and kind of rehash what we've heard tonight. And then we'll have some draft ranking matrix, and then we can collect feedback, you know, and here's what we're thinking of. And, you know, this is, nothing is, it's fluid, I guess you could say. So if we come back with 3 and we're hearing, no, that's not a priority. Again, before we really invest in the wave run up, I think that we'll get it, you know, the best we can. I mean, we may not please everyone, might not, you know, get what you want, but, you know, just keep in mind that this is step 1, and not to say that future couldn't look at other assets too.
In thinking about all that you've said, I'm reminded on the west side that a lot of the property south of where we're talking is privately owned, and with good reason. A lot of them the homes have retaining walls. So when storms are heading towards this area, I guess I'm wondering what kind of impact, if any, does the fact that there's many retaining walls preceding the storm getting to this area impact the surge and the damage that happens in this area?
That's good. Did you look at like south of the boathouse at all? In the
Not yet.
Yeah, we can sort of take a glance, I think, and kind of consider it from that angle of, yeah, when you have the energy deflecting. But I'd have to kind of like zoom out more from what we're looking at here to kind of have a understanding of that, if there is an impact. So that's a good question. Thank you. But we're coming up on 7:30, and I think it would be great, you know, as we have the aerial imagery in the back, and, you know, if you didn't get to speak tonight, you know, you could jot down something that you're concerned. And yeah, I really appreciate just seeing this crowd tonight. So thank you so much. It's really nice. Thank you.
We'll be around for a couple more minutes if anybody has questions that they didn't want to ask in front of the group.